David, Mr. Lewis murmured, his voice trembling. I didn't know why she came at me. I didn't do anything wrong. David gently took his father's hand, but his mind was already racing. He could see the officer who had assaulted his father standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching them. She was younger than he expected, maybe in her 20s, with short brown hair and an attitude that screamed arrogance. David's fists clenched at his sides. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the rage was building inside him. Why had she attacked his father? What had triggered it? Had she been trained to de-escalate situations, or had she let her biases cloud her judgment? The officer avoided eye contact with David, her gaze darting nervously toward the other officers, who were pretending not to notice the tension building in the air. But David wasn't going to let this slide, not for a second. You, David's voice rang out. The officer flinched as if struck. What the hell do you think you're doing? You hurt my father. The officer opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she glanced around, clearly panicking. David wasn't sure what he expected from her, but her silence spoke volumes. This wasn't an isolated incident. Something deeper was going on here, something that couldn't be swept under the rug. But before he could press further, a senior officer stepped forward, his face grim. Captain, he said quietly, we're going to need to take her statement. David's anger flared. You mean we're going to need to protect her, don't you? He retorted, his eyes locked onto the officers. This won't go away, not like everything else. The senior officer didn't respond, but he didn't need to. David could see it in his eyes. This was bigger than they wanted it to be. David stood there, seething with a mix of anger and disbelief. The officer who had attacked his father was now standing with her arms crossed, a blank look on her face, as if she was waiting for the storm to pass. But David wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. His father had spent a lifetime teaching him about respect, dignity, and how to stand up for what was right. But now it felt like those lessons were being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. Dad, we're going to get you home, David said quietly, trying to steady his breathing. He didn't want to show weakness in front of the others, but the sight of his father, sitting there, vulnerable, was too much to bear. Mr. Lewis nodded weakly, his hand still trembling in David's grip. I didn't do anything, son. I didn't know why she was so angry. David wanted to reassure his father, but he didn't have the words. He knew his dad wasn't the type of person who would ever cause trouble. So why had this happened? Why had this officer chosen him as her target? Across the street, a group of bystanders had gathered, phones out, recording the incident. Some of them were whispering to each other, while others were visibly upset. One woman stepped forward, shaking her head. That officer didn't have any reason to touch him. I saw the whole thing. He was just standing there. David turned his gaze toward her. The woman was older, maybe in her 50s, and she had the look of someone who'd seen a lot in her life. There was a certain fire in her eyes that told David she wasn't afraid to speak out. Do you have footage of what happened? David asked, his voice a little softer now. The woman nodded quickly and pulled out her phone. I was just walking my dog when I saw the whole thing. That officer didn't even ask him what he was doing. She just got out of the car and started yelling. I didn't think it was right, but I didn't know what to do. He didn't fight back at all. David took the phone and watched the video, his heart sinking with every second that passed. The footage wasn't clear enough to show the entire interaction, but the audio told a story of its own. The officer's harsh commands, the confusion in his father's voice, and the thud when the punch landed. David clenched his jaw, his hands shaking as he handed the phone back to the woman. Thank you, he said, his voice tight. The woman simply nodded, her expression pained. David stood there for a moment, the video replaying in his mind. He wanted to scream, to confront that officer, but something held him back. There was a bigger problem here, one that stretched far beyond the actions of one rogue cop. What if his father wasn't the first to be targeted by this officer? What if this kind of behavior was more common than anyone wanted to admit? David had spent his life in law enforcement, But even he had trouble trusting the system. He knew it wasn't always fair, especially for people like his father. The night was supposed to be quiet, just another routine evening in the city where people wrapped up their long days and headed home. But for one elderly man, a simple walk to the corner store turned into a nightmare he never saw coming. Mr. Lewis, a 72-year-old retired school teacher, was no stranger to the neighborhood. Everyone knew him, his warm smile, the way he greeted folks with a nod, and the stories he shared with kids about the good old days. He had lived in this community for decades, watched it change, watched people come and go. But no matter what, he always felt safe. That night, however, safety was the last thing he felt. As he shuffled down the sidewalk, a police car rolled up beside him. The officer inside, young, white, and with a hardened stare, didn't see Mr. Lewis as a man, as a human being. She saw something else, something she was ready to confront. Without warning, she threw open her door and stepped out. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" Mr. Lewis stopped, confused. He turned slowly, his hands instinctively open at his sides. "Just heading to the store, officer," he said calmly. "Is something wrong?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him, her hand resting on her belt. Maybe she saw the old hoodie he was wearing. Maybe she noticed his dark skin and decided that was enough. Whatever it was, something in her eyes shifted. "Don't play games with me," she snapped. "I said, what are you doing here?" Mr. Lewis, ever patient, tried again. "Ma'am, I live just down the block. I'm just grabbing some milk." But patience wasn't what she was looking for. In a matter of seconds, she was on him. Shoving, accusing. The next thing he knew, her fist connected with his chest. The shock of it took his breath away. People across the street stopped, their eyes wide. A few reached for their phones. Mr. Lewis staggered but didn't fall. He looked up at her, pain and disbelief in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Maybe she didn't have one. Maybe she didn't care. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Mr. Lewis had a son, and his son wasn't just anyone. Just a few miles away, Police Captain David Lewis was finishing up his shift when his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize, a shaky voice on the other end. "Captain, you need to come quick. It's your father." His blood ran cold. He grabbed his keys and ran for the door. What happened next would change everything. David Lewis had always respected the badge, even when it weighed heavily on his shoulders. Growing up, he'd seen the world through a different lens. His father, a quiet man of principle, had taught him that respect and kindness were earned, not demanded. David never forgot those lessons, but he had also learned the harsh realities of policing. The endless reports, the difficult choices, and the unspoken divisions in the system. It wasn't easy to find balance when your job was to protect and serve in a world that sometimes made it feel impossible. But now, as he sped toward his father's neighborhood, the weight of his badge felt more suffocating than ever. His heart raced, his mind spun. How could something like this happen? His father, a beloved figure in the community, a man who had never caused a stir. Yet here he was, caught in a situation he never should have been in. David had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew he had to act quickly. As he pulled into the neighborhood, he could see the flashing lights of squad cars. A crowd had gathered near the corner where his father had been. Murmurs floated through the air like whispers of something dark, something sinister. David's pulse quickened. He jumped out of his car and made his way toward the scene, his badge clipped to his belt, but almost feeling like a target. "Captain, you need to stand back," one of the officers said as David approached. David didn't pause. He pushed through the officer's hand and kept walking. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. "Where's my father?" he asked sharply. The officer hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously between David and the scene unfolding. "He's over there, sir," the officer said, pointing to a bench under a streetlight, where an elderly man sat. It was Mr. Lewis, his face bruised, his eyes wide with confusion, but still alert. David's stomach dropped. This wasn't right. His father had always been strong, physically and mentally. To see him like this, broken, disoriented, humiliated, felt like a punch to the gut. He rushed toward him, the words forming in his mind, but his throat was dry. "Dad." David's voice cracked as he knelt beside his father. The older man looked up at him, his face pale but filled with recognition. Henderson hesitated before speaking, his eyes darting toward the man and the officer who stood in the shadows. "This goes back years. It's not just about one bad officer. It's about corruption that runs deep within the department. People higher up are involved, people who have been controlling everything from the inside." David's heart hammered in his chest. The pieces were falling into place, but it didn't make any sense. How could a department, a system he had devoted his life to, have become so corrupted? "Then why didn't you say something sooner?" David's voice was sharp now, raw with frustration. "Why have you been covering this up all this time?" Henderson's face grew pale. "Because I was part of it. I didn't have a choice, David. But you're different. You're a part of the future of this department. You're still in a position to change things before it all falls apart." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind spun. Henderson, the one person he had trusted in the department, had been complicit in the same corruption that had just destroyed his father's life. But that wasn't all. Before David could process it, the officer who had been speaking out suddenly collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest. Her eyes widened in horror as she gasped for air. David rushed to her side, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this another attack? Or had something gone horribly wrong? "David, don't." Henderson started, but it was too late. The officer's hand went limp in David's grasp, and her body went still. David's breath caught in his throat. Her death was no accident. She had known too much, and now she was gone. The shock of it all hit him like a ton of bricks. Everything had been leading up to this moment, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of something far worse. As David stood there, frozen in disbelief, the man who had been orchestrating everything stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "That's the cost of knowing too much," he said, his voice cold. "But it's over now. You've lost." David's blood ran cold. He couldn't let this man walk away. He couldn't let the system win. But as the man turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows, and everything changed. It was his father. Mr. Lewis, looking stronger than he had in hours, stood at the edge of the street, his face etched with determination. David's heart skipped a beat. How was he here? How had he? "Dad, what are you doing?" David called out, rushing to him. Mr. Lewis looked at him, his eyes hard but filled with resolve. "I've been through worse than this, son. And so have you. This isn't over. It's time to take it all down." David's mind reeled. His father, the one person who had been the victim, now stood beside him, ready to fight. The truth had been buried deep for so long, but now, David realized, it wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about tearing down everything that had held them both captive. The final twist came as the man who had been orchestrating the entire scheme took one last glance at them, his face suddenly contorted in anger. "You think you've won? You've just started a war you can't finish." As the man disappeared into the night, the weight of everything hit David. It wasn't just about saving his father anymore. It was about the future of the department and the fight that was only beginning. The road ahead would be long, but as David stood next to his father, he knew they weren't alone. This was just the beginning of a battle that would shake everything to its core. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he had a chance to finally make things right. As the man disappeared into the shadows, David stood frozen for a moment, his breath heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. His father's presence beside him was a grounding force, the unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. David could feel the tension in his body easing, but he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The corruption that had plagued the department for so long couldn't just be erased in one night. But this was the beginning of something new. David turned to his father, who gave him a small, knowing nod. The old man had been through so much in his life, and now he was stepping into a fight that was more than just about personal vengeance. This was about systemic change, about exposing the darkness that had poisoned the very institution David had once devoted his life to. "We're not done, son," Mr. Lewis said, his voice steady, but there was a fire in his eyes that David hadn't seen in years. "They'll come for us, but we'll keep fighting. You have to make sure the truth gets out. No more hiding, no more lies." The night was growing colder, and David could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The sirens had died down, but the chaos was far from over. David took one last look at the officer who had assaulted his father. She was still standing off to the side, eyes darting around nervously. For a moment, David considered confronting her again, demanding answers, but he knew better. There were too many eyes on them now. If he pushed too hard, if he made the wrong move, it could all come crashing down. Just as David was about to step away, Chief Henderson approached him again, this time with a more serious expression. "Captain, I need you to come with me," he said, his tone tight and professional. But David wasn't fooled. There was something off about the way Henderson was acting, as if he was hiding something. David followed the chief without saying a word, his mind racing with possibilities. They stopped a few feet away from the others, out of earshot. Henderson glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening before speaking in a low voice. "I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation, David. You need to be careful." David's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? My father was assaulted. We have video evidence. You can't just cover this up." Henderson's eyes flicked nervously. "It's not that simple. You don't know who you're dealing with. This isn't just about one officer or one bad decision. There are things happening within the department, things I'm not in a position to explain right now. But if you keep pushing, it's going to cost you." David's blood ran cold. The warning was clear, but it only fueled his determination. "What things?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if even speaking the words might make them real. Henderson hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the officers in the distance. "I can't tell you everything, but there are people at the top who will do anything to protect their own. You're not just challenging one officer, David. You're challenging the entire system." David's mind reeled. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about everything he had believed in, the badge, the system, justice itself. If he exposed the truth now, there would be no going back. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. There was no turning back now. He had to finish this, no matter the cost. Just then, a voice interrupted their conversation. It was the officer, the one who had assaulted his father. She was standing a few steps away, her face pale. "Captain, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely audible. David turned slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on him. This was it, the moment that would define everything. Whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same. David turned toward the officer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process what she might say. There was something in her demeanor that told him this wasn't just another plea for forgiveness. She was tense, almost as if she were carrying a burden too heavy to bear. The air between them thickened as she shifted uneasily on her feet, clearly hesitant. I have to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. David could feel his heart race. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the one piece of the puzzle that could change everything. He stepped closer, trying to hide the urgency in his tone. "What is it?" The officer glanced around nervously, her eyes darting toward the group of officers a few yards away. She was clearly looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. David took a step forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You've got to speak up now. What happened? Why did you do it?" For a moment, The officer said nothing, her breath shallow as she stood frozen. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't supposed to be the one. I wasn't supposed to be the one out there tonight. David blinked, not understanding. What do you mean? I didn't know who he was, she continued, her voice shaking more with every word. I didn't know what I was getting into. I was just following orders. David's mind went into overdrive. Orders from who? He demanded, leaning in closer. Her eyes darted around again, her lips trembling. I can't say. But someone above me, someone high up in the department, they knew who he was. They knew his son was a captain. Her voice faltered, but she pushed forward. They told me to keep him in check. They said to make sure he didn't talk to anyone. David's stomach dropped. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was something bigger, much bigger than he had ever imagined. The officer's words were a bombshell, but she wasn't done. There's something going on in this department, something they don't want people to know about. His thoughts were interrupted by the senior officer from earlier, who was now stepping up beside him. Captain, we need to get your father checked out. We'll have an ambulance here shortly, the officer said, trying to sound calm, but David could hear the underlying tension in his voice. David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to face the officer who had attacked his father. She was still standing off to the side, nervously adjusting her uniform, her eyes darting around as if she were waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. David's gut twisted. This was far from over, but what he didn't know was just how deep this ran. Behind the officer, a black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh streetlights. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his face familiar to David. It was Chief Henderson, the head of the department. David's stomach churned. Henderson had always played things close to the vest, never one to take a strong stance on anything controversial. But he'd known David for years, watched him rise through the ranks, and David had always assumed the man had his back. Now, standing there, he wasn't so sure. Captain, Henderson said, his voice cold, I understand your father's been involved in an incident. David's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about the entire system. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. There was no way they could just sweep this under the rug. But would they make it go away anyway? He locked eyes with Henderson. You have no idea what's really happening here, do you? David's voice was low, but the anger was unmistakable. You're all just going to cover this up, aren't you? Henderson hesitated, just long enough for David to see the flicker of doubt. But before anything else could be said, the officer who had punched his father finally spoke up, her voice shaking. I didn't mean to hurt him. I was just doing my job. Her words hung in the air, meaningless and hollow. David knew better than to believe her. But the question now wasn't about her. It was about everything that led to that moment, and whether anyone would have the courage to face the truth. The tension in the air felt thick enough to cut with a knife. David couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The words he had exchanged with Chief Henderson echoed in his mind. Asterisk, you have no idea what's really happening here, do you? Asterisk, he hadn't meant to say it like that, but now that it was out, he couldn't take it back. There was something in Henderson's eyes, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before, and for the first time in years, David wondered if his trust in the system, his loyalty to his badge, was misplaced. The officers around him went about their business, trying to keep the scene from spiraling further, but David wasn't focused on them anymore. His mind was on the young officer who had assaulted his father. She stood there, eyes downcast, shifting uncomfortably, but David could see it. The fear, the guilt. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from accountability. No, this was something deeper, something more personal. Her story wasn't adding up, but she wasn't going to come clean on her own. He could sense that much. And then there was the bigger question. How deep did this go? Was she just one rogue officer, or was there a larger issue with the department itself? David didn't know who to trust anymore, not when every person he spoke to seemed to have their own agenda. He turned back to his father, who was now sitting on the curb, trying to collect himself. Mr. Lewis looked exhausted, his face bruised, but showing no signs of breaking. The old man had lived through so much in his life: racism, hardship, poverty, and yet here he was, still standing. But David knew this wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about something bigger, something that would make or break everything David had fought for in his career. "Dad," David said softly, kneeling beside him, "we're going to make this right. I promise you." Mr. Lewis nodded, but his eyes told a different story. They were filled with a quiet sadness, the kind that came from a lifetime of injustices that could never be fully repaired. But David wasn't about to let that be the end of it. This wasn't just about fixing the damage done to his father. It was about exposing a system that had failed too many for too long. He had to make sure that what happened here didn't fade into the background. That would be the easy way out for everyone involved. David swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He had always looked up to his father, but now he realized just how much of a warrior his dad truly was. Through every injustice, every setback, Mr. Lewis had fought, quietly, steadily, never backing down. Now, it was David's turn. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. The department was a fortress, and taking it down would require more than just a few brave souls. But the allies they needed were already out there. The officer who had spoken up had risked everything to tell the truth. She had died because of it. Her sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. Her story would be heard, and it would push David to keep moving forward. He owed it to her. Over the next few weeks, things started to shift. David worked tirelessly, using every connection, every shred of information, to expose the web of corruption that had been festering inside the department for years. The media began to take notice, as did the higher-ups who had tried to silence him. With the help of whistleblowers and even some unexpected allies within the department, David was able to shine a light on the dark practices that had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. Chief Henderson was removed from his position, and the man who had tried to intimidate them was also arrested for his role in the conspiracy. But that wasn't the end of the story. As the investigation unfolded, David discovered even more layers of corruption, connections to organized crime, and people who had been profiting off the suffering of others. It wasn't just about one rogue officer or one corrupt chief. It was a deeply embedded system that had to be torn apart from the inside. David knew that the battle wasn't over. There were still many battles to fight, and the scars of what had happened would remain. But with his father's unwavering strength behind him, and the truth finally coming to light, David could see a path forward. A path that would allow him to rebuild the department, to restore the trust that had been broken, and to make sure that the sacrifices made along the way were never forgotten. In the end, David stood at the edge of something new. The weight of his father's legacy, of the lives lost, and the injustices suffered, had all led him to this moment. The fight had changed him, had made him see that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones that required standing alone, fighting for what was right, even when the world tried to crush you. But in the end, David knew he wasn't alone. He had his father. He had the truth. And as long as they had that, there was nothing they couldn't face. The road ahead would be long, but it was no longer uncertain. It was theirs to shape, and the fight for justice, for the future, would never stop.